May I have your attention, please? Welcome to you all after the beautiful but perhaps a little bit tiresome cruise on the Aegean Sea. I hope you feel all well. Looking forward to a bright day. We have in the coming 1.5 hours 3 speakers, but I will first start with the household rules. The speakers have 20 minutes each. After 15 minutes, I will tell them they have 5 minutes left. And I would like to ask you please to put out and silence all your cell phones. Thank you. The first speaker we have is La Joy from Ireland. He will present a paper on Murder by Throat, the War of Independence in Ireland, 1916-1921. La Joy is Port Heritage Director at Dublin Port. He is a graduate of University College Dublin, Leicester University, the Getty Leadership Institute. He is currently chairman of the Irish National Committee of the Blue Shield, member of the board of directors of the Irish Museums Association and Military Heritage of Ireland Trust. Among others, in the decade of commemoration, 2012-2017, he was involved in the multiple projects like World War I exhibitions, Recovered Voices 1914-1916. Please, Lara, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for that introduction. The basis for my talk today is a book I'm writing on the War of Independence in County Tipperary, so I'll be using a lot of references to that particular county. I'd like to thank again the Greek Commission for a wonderful Congress, which I've really enjoyed over the last few days. I think this is my first lecture in public in 18 months, so it's nice to be off Zoom and actually seeing people and being able to talk in the public. So the topic I'm going to look at is murder by the throat, and the areas I'm going to look at are very much looking at the participants and those who were involved in it. And I'm going to do that in 20 minutes, otherwise the chair is going to kill me. So I'm going to focus on the IRA, but also on different aspects of the Crown forces. In Ireland, we call the collective forces of the British government the Crown forces, so it includes the Navy, the Army, and of course the police. So very much what I want to talk about is the combat effectiveness of those two forces, the Crown forces and the IRA. And the War of Independence in Ireland is essentially the same throughout the 20th century, these wars of independence, guerrilla warfare. In the context of Ireland, of course, it's one of the few to succeed. 75% of wars of independence in the 20th century actually fail. They don't succeed. And it proves to be very, very expensive for the British Exchequer, but also for the Irish, in leading a lot of its destruction of villages and towns around the country. However, there are no big battles. It's very much guerrilla warfare. It's person-to-person, small operations. There are no large massacres or the burning of torturing of villages, but it's that kind of very close quarters. And the weapons that are used by the Irish are very, very much the weapons that are at hand. We're an island nation, so getting access to weapons is quite difficult. And of course, the Royal Navy is on the sea to make sure that the weapons didn't come in. And you can see there that well over 2,850 deaths over the period. And just to kind of give you a breakdown by the various counties, Cork is the most violent down the south of all the counties, followed by Antrim in the north, and then Tipperary comes in at number 4 with 158. So these are the kind of number of deaths that are occurring. Now we break that down further and we look at the kind of impact on Dublin and also on Tipperary. We can see the breakdown. In Tipperary, it's a very balanced number of deaths between civilians, participants on the IRA, and with the British government forces. But in Dublin, the figure of 45% is quite alarming because that's the number of civilians that were killed. So again, because it's an urban setting, civilians are always in the background in an urban setting, and sadly, in a lot of the attacks and ambushes, they're the ones that become casualties. It must be remembered at this time that Ireland is very, very much, or Dublin is very, very much a city of empire. These red dots that you see here are the various military barracks in Dublin. Throughout the 19th century, the British government went on a very large building programme for barracks around the country, and there was well over 100 barracks and 11 alone in Dublin. So they're very much a city of empire. When we break down the War of Independence It can be broken down beginning in 1916 with a very short failed rising, then a build-up to small operations in 1918 and 1919, larger scale attacks, and then the introduction from England of the Black and Tans and auxiliaries, a kind of a paramilitary force sent in to deal with the IRA. But it's the final section from November 1920 that the war becomes particularly violent, creation of very large flying columns or platoons of IRA men in the countryside and in the cities as active service units. And it's a very, very violent period that can be only described as quite brutal. Luckily enough, it does break down from a political point of view into a truce in July of 1921, and that kind of simmers things down. But it was reaching a stage where it was going to become particularly violent. When we look at the IRA, it's a very, very small force. The population of Ireland at this time is just over 3 million, and about 3,000 of them in the Irish Republican Army. We know that 17,000 in the end received pensions for their service, but another well over 80,000 failed to receive pensions. That's not because they did not fight. It was down to the fact that the country couldn't afford to be giving out pensions later on in the 20th century. Lieutenant Colonel Duggan, who's the historian of the Army, quoted that without standard weaponry, collective training and concentration of force, it was unlikely that guerrilla warfare, no matter how skillfully waged, could achieve military victory. And when we look why the War of Independence works is because it's not just the military aspect, of course, it's the political aspect, and it was very much a people's war. The IRA had the support of the people, and that is why it very much succeeded. The IRA follow very much after the 1916 Rising. The Rising was very short, it was failed, but the execution policy by the British government changed public opinion. And that's what allowed them to have that support later on in 1919 to 21. But in particular for those commanders who had fought with the IRA in the 1916 Rising, what they learned was you couldn't have a pitched battle with the British Army. You had to adapt and carry out guerrilla attacks and keep it short and keep it simple. There was a brigade structure throughout the country. Each county had brigades. In Dublin, you had 2 Fingal brigades in the north and then the Dublin brigade. But the reality on the ground when it came to fighting, it was a smaller group of men who carried out the attack, supported by a women's auxiliary called the Cumann na Mán. In the countryside, in places like Tipperary, you would have had 3 brigades. So a lot of command, a lot of structure, and a general headquarters. But the reality was that down it came to the fighting, it was whoever was available was the person who was involved. As I mentioned earlier on, weapons are always a big concern in Ireland because getting them into the country is quite difficult. Mauser automatic pistols were very, very popular with the IRA. This particular one owned by a well-known veteran, Vinnie Byrne. And these are known in Ireland as Peter the Painters. It's a nickname that's given to them. But the reality is that shotguns were the most common weapon used in this war. Very, very effective, and they caused 30% of casualties because that's what was at hand. Very, very useful at night, as you can imagine. Quite ineffective for distance, but also ineffective during daytime. And here, again, is a small pistol hidden in a dictionary, and this is how weapons were smuggled around the city in Dublin for carrying out assassinations. The most successful operation that the IRA did was in November 1920, on a day that's become known as Bloody Sunday, when 13 British Army officers were attacked and executed. It was a very violent attack. Some of these individuals were not actually involved in British intelligence, but again, the propaganda from the IRA was that they were, and many of them were shot in front of their families and wives, so quite an horrific experience. In retaliation, the Crown Forces killed 15 and wounded 60 at a football game, a Gaelic Football Association game, between Tipperary and Dublin, and led to, again, internationally huge negative response from the international media against the British government because of that. When it comes and looks at weapons, again, weapons are smuggled in. 1916 was supposed to be a successful operation once the German guns arrived, but they were captured, and that led really why the 1916 Rising never succeeded. And during the War of Independence, the main source of weapons is from Liverpool, so that run from Liverpool over to Dublin. And the first Thompson machine guns were brought into Ireland during this time and operated in 1921. Within Dublin Port was central to the importation of weapons. A specialised unit was established within the port, directly reporting to General Headquarters to make sure weapons came in. Quite a large number of men, 155 men, were involved in Liverpool supporting that effort. But you can see at the bottom there the very small number of weapons that were actually successfully brought in, which again shows you that the Crown Forces and the British government had the upper hand. And of course, it was never enough for the IRA when they were fighting. Again, a lot of weapons being captured from them and also being used by them. Again, weapons like this taken during attacks. So the most common way to get a weapon in Ireland was from the British Army and from the police. So the Royal Irish Constabulary was the first group that the IRA went up against. It was very much an Irish-based organisation, 70% Roman Catholic, but the officer class was very much predominantly from the British establishment. And you can see that it had to be supported from 1919 with English volunteers. So Irishmen started to resign, some in protest, but also in fear. A very large campaign was taken against them by the IRA and their families. And 10,000 English volunteers had to become brought in, and they became known as the Black and Tans. And there's a very high death rate for the police, and you can see the death rates there for them. So most policemen, though, who were killed during this period were actually Irishmen. So you see a civil war occurring between two sets of Irishmen at this time. And later on, of course, we have our own civil war after the War of Independence. Today, because this police force is quite heavily armed, today's Irish police are actually unarmed. And there's a very strong tradition of not having armed police. And it's something that goes back to those days. This just gives you an idea of what the police looked like at that time. You can see very much well-equipped, having carbines, having revolvers, and access to armories in each police station, and very, very mobile. The famous Auxiliary Division were a group that was also brought into Ireland at this time in 1920. They were retired British Army officers, again, a large pool of officers left over from World War I, very well highly paid, very well equipped, but even the British Labour Party Commission, when they visited Ireland in 1920, described them as 1% of men of very bad character, so not fully suspect or supported by the state. The British Prime Minister Lloyd George had great confidence in these cadets. He thought this would break the IRA, and declared on the 20th of November that the Crown Forces had murder by the throat, and that's where my title of my talk comes from. And again, as I mentioned, the Bloody Sunday happens the next day as a response from the IRA, so he quite makes this public statement that the IRA be crushed, and the next day they shoot 13 British Army officers in that operation. Reprisals become huge during this period, and this leads to a lot of the deaths, as I mentioned earlier on. In County Tipperary, if you're an IRA volunteer, your chances of being shot were very, very high. But the police in particular start to attack the economy of Ireland, which is heavily based on farms, so therefore creams and milk creameries were destroyed, which led to huge economic problems for the country. And the British Army get more involved in the war late in 1920, and they start to carry out reprisals and attacks. And of course, the IRA also starts to carry out its own attacks on suspected spies, and almost a form of paranoia takes over them. They become very suspicious of everybody, and of course carry out attacks. This is just another example of Templemore Town Hall, burnt down on the 16th of August 1920 as a reprisal of the killing of a district inspector policeman, D.I. Wilson. During the fire, a Major Beattie from Dublin, military cost holder, and a Lance Corporal Fuggle died. Lance Corporal Fuggle had been sent in to burn down the building, had got confined to the building as it went up in flames, and the Major had gone in to try and save him, but both sadly died. And again, coming back to this theme of destruction of towns, the town of Balbriggan was completely destroyed by the auxiliaries in 1920, including a lot of factories, which again had a huge impact. In Dublin, a special unit was established to try and break down the IRA importation of weapons called Q Company, and they were based in Dublin Port. And you can see very much based from a Navy background. 56% of them were from the Navy, merchant Navy, and they knew how ports worked, they knew how importing and exporting worked. So this was the response, official response from the state to take on the IRA in their smuggling campaigns. Those photographs there show where they were based in a former hotel. And the photograph on the top is after an attack by the IRA where the grenades were thrown into the officers' mess and didn't kill anyone, and that's why all the auxiliaries are smiling and quite happy. The British Army was over 60,000 strong at its peak in Ireland, got very much more involved once martial law was declared for the whole island and almost take over operations. The British Labour Party, again, when it looks at the British Army, felt that it was suffering, it wasn't fully up to the job at the time. And this is really kind of after World War I. People didn't want to be in the army, they wanted to demob, and that's fully understandable. Before 1913, traditionally there were 2 divisions in Ireland. They have been there for over 100 years, the 5th and the 6th divisions, never fully at full strength. But when we look at a map of 1921, you can see the scale of the 60,000 troops. You've got the 5th Division, the 6th Division, but Dublin has its own division, the Dublin District, with well over 11,000. Ulster, which is now going to be separated from Ireland, of course, has a smaller group. It's very much more supportive of the British government. In Dublin, again, substantial forces led by this gentleman, G.F. Boyd, who joined the British Army in South Africa as a young soldier, had worked his way from soldier the whole way up to general. And again, the British Army are very, very well equipped. You all know this, the equipment that they would have had in World War I. And you can imagine the firepower that could be brought by one platoon against an attacking IRA force, and a very effective one. The British Army itself, again, gets involved, as I say, with curfews, imposing the rules, and is also involved, just at the end there, a proclamation is issued in Dublin that civilians were warned to halt if called on to do so, otherwise they were liable to shot. What you start to see is civilians being shot by sentries, British Army sentries, and 41 civilians are killed in a 6-month period in Dublin alone for failing to halt to a sentry. And you can imagine their fear. 5 minutes. The response then in 1921 was to start to mechanise, to up armour, something that we've seen in the wars over the last 20 years. Rolls-Royce Irish cars proved very, very successful in the countryside and brought up firepower that the police and the army had and badly needed. The regimental history of the Dublin Division says they proved themselves to be excellent, especially in the streets of Dublin, where they were practically unstoppable. So this was a game changer that was starting to happen in 1921. And also up-arming of trucks. This is a Lancia truck purchased by the British Army when they were fighting in Italy, and then brought back, 122 of them brought back, and then up-armoured in Dublin. And this again is a response to what's happening on the roads and byways of Ireland, where if you're in an open car, you're very subject to being killed by the IRA. So again, it shows you the kind of immediate response. Everyone's learning from their experiences of 1920 and 21 and kind of ensuring that they kind of survive. Just very quickly then, we come into the last 5 minutes, is just to look at the RAF. I don't have time to look at the Royal Navy or the Coast Guard, but again, the focus for the British Empire is changing at this time. It's very much on the expansion of the empire. It's going to places like Iraq and elsewhere, Palestine. So in Ireland, there was only one wing with 2 squadrons based in Armagh in the west and in Baldonnel. Unlike in other countries like in Iraq, where planes were used to bomb and to machine gun, again, because Ireland is closer to England, it was seen for political and also for international reasons that wasn't a possibility. So planes are very, very restricted to airmail service, VIP, and later on carry out reconnaissance for very big drives into the countryside. And that again gives you an idea of a large number of Air Force bases. So, to come to conclusion then, it was a disappointing military performance by the Crown Forces. There was a lack of a clear definition, and that definition only kind of comes in the middle of 1921, just prior to the truce. Roles and powers of the various Crown Forces are never fully defined. There was no control of the police force. The police had started to implode, and there was definitely no control over these new auxiliaries and black and tans, who, from a kind of PR point of view, were a disaster and led more support from the Irish to the IRA. And there was a lack of unified command of security forces, which the IRA were to benefit from. The IRA succeeded in breaking down the legal and administrative system in Ireland. So they took over the courts, they took over the rates, taxes, and again, that deprived the authority of the state. And since 1916, the Irish had started to lose faith in the British government. Prior to 1916, there was a general support of the British government, and that disappears over the next 6 years. The British Army is in crisis, as I said earlier on. There's a shortfall in experienced NCOs and officers. And finally, as with all guerrilla wars, the Irish did not have to win. They won by not losing, and it was up to the Crown forces to defeat them, which they failed to do. So it was a stalemate, and once you have a stalemate in the military context, of course, that allowed the politicians to have a truce, which lasted for 6 months and led to a treaty. The Popular military historian Max Hastings has argued that throughout its history, British repeatedly sought to ignore the importance of mass on the battlefield, dispatching inadequate forces to assert moral and strategic principles. And I think that's what happened in Ireland. If they had sent out the forces that were needed in late 1919, the war would have gone their way. However, for the Irish, a civil war was to break out a year later, when 80% of the IRA went against the government, the new Irish government, and went into a civil war, which of course is another story, probably for another conference. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lar. Well done. And I would like now to introduce the second speaker, and it's Thomas Jakel from Czechia, and he will present a paper on Czechs and Slovaks, 1914-1918, the World War, the War of Independence, and the Civil War, three simultaneous contexts. Thomas Jakel studied archival science and finished his MA at the Charles University Prague. He worked there for 5 years in the Prague Municipal Archives, and since 2002 he is a historian at the Military History Institute in Prague. His main focus is the Czech-Slovak participants in both world wars. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning of 1914, the vast majority of Czechs were citizens of Austria and Slovaks were citizens of Hungary within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At the beginning of the First World War, almost 1 million of them were conscripts of the Austro-Hungarian army. 4 years later, at the end of 1918, most Czechs and Slovaks were citizens of the independent Czechoslovak Republic. The Czechoslovak volunteers who played a major role in the creation of the new state by their struggle alongside armies of the Entente fought in the context of at least 3 wars simultaneously. In 1914, on the onset of the war that would later be referred to as the Great War or World War I, the Czech nation experienced a long century of unprecedented spiritual and social growth, accompanied by a rapid economic growth. It developed an advanced culture, art and education, a strong industry and agriculture, all the attributes of a modern nation, except one, namely its own state. The war enthusiasm described in practically all the states entering the war in the summer of 1914 was not observed among the Czech population of Austro-Hungary, who were conscripted into the war. The emerging World War was not their war.
Sir, could you put out your phone, please?
The eventual German and Austro-Hungarian victory would have brought a worsening of their living conditions and set them in the role of...
Sorry, Thomas, could you please... Sir, could you please otherwise leave the room to stop your phone? Sir? Sir, I think it's wise otherwise to leave the room for a moment. Sir, could you otherwise try to stop your phone outside this room, please?
Thank you.
Okay, Thomas. Continue, please.
The war enthusiasm described in practically all the states entering the war in the summer of 1914 was not observed among the Czech population of Austria-Hungary who were conscripted into the war. The emerging World War was not their war. The eventual German and Austro-Hungarian victory would have brought a worsening of their living conditions and set them in the role of second-class citizens, in the same way as Slovaks already were in Hungary at the time. On the other hand, the Czechs and Slovaks living in the Entente countries immediately supported the fight against the Central Powers and began to form volunteer units for this purpose. Czech and Slovak compatriots in France, Britain, Russia and Serbia were at the origin of their spontaneous birth. Already in August 1914, on the initiative of the Compatriot Association in Paris, 300 volunteers formed the Company Nazdar as part of the French Foreign Legion. Almost at the same time, the Czech Družina, a battalion-sized military unit under Russian command, was formed in Russia, composed of Czechs and Slovaks living there. After replenishment from Czechs and Slovaks from amongst prisoners of war, former conscripts of the Austro-Hungarian army, the Czech Družina expanded in January 1916 into the Czechoslovak Rifle Regiment and later to Czechoslovak Brigade. Also in the summer of 1914, a detachment of Czechs compatriots from Belgrade took part in fierce fighting with the advancing Austro-Hungarian army. Further attempts to form independent Czechoslovak units in Serbia from former prisoners of war were thwarted by the critical development of the military situation of Serbia in the autumn of 1915. The first political organization of the Czechoslovak resistance abroad was the Czech Foreign Committee. Its proclamation of November 1915 spoke of a united effort to win an independent state. From February 1916 onwards, the Czechoslovak National Council was established in Paris as the central political headquarters of the resistance, with branches gradually being built up in Russia, Italy, Britain, Switzerland, and the USA. It was headed by Professor Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, a member of Austrian Parliament, who was financially supported by numerous compatriot associations operating worldwide, and politically and intelligence-wise on the domestic resistance. The main task of the Czechoslovak National Council remained the creation of an autonomous national army within the Entente countries, despite the majority of the male population in the Czech lands and Slovakia had to put on the uniform of the Austro-Hungarian army in order to undergo their first frontline experience. By 1917, the exhaustion of all the fighting sides was already evident on the fronts. Nevertheless, such events occurred in this year which had a decisive influence on the course of the war. In early 1917, Germany declared an unrestricted submarine war with the aim of cutting Britain off from raw materials and food supplies and imposing its own peace terms. At the same time, U-boat attacks were intended to break Germany's naval blockade. Although the losses of the British fleet became catastrophic in the spring and summer months, Germany failed to decide the war. On the contrary, the United States declared war on Germany on April 2, 1917. This tipped the scales in the long-term strategic perspective in favor of the Entente states. The position of the Entente, on the other hand, began to decline in its weakest link, Russia. Setbacks at the front, enormous human losses, and a disastrous situation in the rear led to a revolution in Russia on the 12th of March 1917, on the 27th of February, according to the old calendar then in use in Russia. 3 days later, the Tsar abdicated. The new Russian provisional government planned for the summer of 1917 an offensive in the direction of Lvov or Lemberg to help the exhausted Entente forces on the Western Front. In the meantime, the German Kaiser took advantage of the notorious Order No. 1, by which the Russian provisional government permitted political work within the Russian army. In April 1917, the Germans transported Russian extremist Vladimir Lenin from his Swiss exile to Russia and provided him with considerable financial funds. Anti-war propaganda, led by members of Lenin's faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party, who called themselves Bolsheviks or communists, then eroded the morale of the Russian army at the front. The Russian summer offensive of 1917, sometimes called the Kerensky offensive, thus ended in failure. Decomposed by German-funded communist propaganda, the Russian army failed to take advantage of local frontline breakthroughs and was unable to make any considerable advance. In the subsequent counteroffensive, German troops got through deep into the east, and their advance resulted in the complete collapse of the Russian army. The Czechoslovak Brigade was one of the few units to keep its combat capability, besides, for example, Cossacks Cavalry or Belgian Armored Car Battalion. And it covered the retreat, or rather escape, of the Russian army towards Tarnopol and in the subsequent fighting. The unexpectedly successful operations of the Czechoslovak Brigade fundamentally changed the hesitant attitude of the Russian provisional government towards the creation of new Czechoslovak units. The brigade expanded into a division, and the inflow of new volunteers from the prison camps almost immediately created a second division, and from both an army corps of nearly 40,000 men. By the end of 1917, the Czechoslovak Corps included 8 rifle regiments, 2 reserve regiments, artillery, technical and other corps units. The organization of the Second Corps, which should go to the Western Front, was being prepared. After the Bolshevik October Revolution, or more precisely, the Lenin's Contra-Revolution, the implementation of these plans became extremely complicated. The Bolsheviks, in return for financial aid from the German Empire in their rise to power, immediately concluded an armistice with the Central Powers. Although they lost crushingly in the free elections to the Constituent Assembly held back in December 1917, nevertheless, they were no longer going to abide by the results of the elections and began to systematically liquidate their political opponents. The country plunged into civil war. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk's instructions stressed the neutrality of Czechoslovak Corps in the country's incipient internal political rivalry and its hurried departure for France. Lenin assumed that, with German support, he would gain enough power to put all presidents and crowned heads of the world, including Wilhelm II himself, in front of a fire squad. However, when the Bolsheviks acted too self-confidently against the Central Powers during the Brest-Litovsk peace negotiations, the German and Austrian emperors made it strictly clear where the real winner lay: in the East. In February 1918, their troops began to advance eastward, and the collapsed Russian army and small and weak Red Guards could not effectively counter. The Germans, Austro-Hungarians, and Ottomans occupied the Baltics, part of Finland, Belarus, Ukraine, and Transcaucasia. Virtually unopposed. The Czechoslovak Corps, formed near Kiev at the time, had to leave the Ukraine before the German advance. It's the blue arrow. After several skirmishes with the advancing German units, the Corps retreated to Russia. With the signing of the Peace of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, defeated Russia became a vassal of the Central Powers, to whom it paid reparations and supplied raw materials and agricultural products. Czechoslovak units made an agreement with its government, represented by People's Commissar for Nationality Stalin, to leave for France via Vladivostok. In return, they pledged neutrality in internal political affairs and the surrender of most weapons, except those used for the necessary security of transport trains. The disarmament took place in Penza, from where the individual transports continued eastwards, along the Trans-Siberian Railway. In Penza, on the other hand, a Czechoslovak regiment of the Red Army was being formed. At the end of April 1918, Lenin's government, under German diplomatic pressure, virtually stopped the movements of Czechoslovak transports. Railway priority was given to transport of German and Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war repatriated from Russian prison camps. The inactivity at the railway stations, to which transport of liberated prisoners, now de facto reinforcement for the Western Front, were passing in the opposite direction, radicalized the Czechoslovak soldiers. The most serious incident occurred on the 14th of May 1918 in Chelyabinsk, where Austro-Hungarian soldier threw a piece of cast iron from a train at Czechoslovaks, severely injuring a Czechoslovak soldier who was considered dead. The Czechoslovaks immediately found the culprit and killed him. The local Soviet arrested the Czechoslovak witnesses, who voluntarily and unarmed came to the Soviet building to give a statement to investigate the incident. So on the 17th of May 1918, the 3rd and 6th Czechoslovak regiments occupied Chelyabinsk and liberated the prisoners. The conflict with the Soviet government could still be peacefully settled, but after the Czechoslovaks intercepted a telegram from People's Commissar of Defense Trotsky on the 21st of May, ordering local Soviets, the Czechoslovak troops to be abolished and either transferred to the Red Army or formed into working detachments, the Provisional Executive Committee of the Czechoslovak Army decided to leave for Vladivostok regardless of the orders of Lenin's government. The same principle that led to the disintegration of the Russian army in 1917, that is the possibility of political work in the army, in this case led to the self-preservation behavior within the Czechoslovak Corps. Trotsky reacted on the 25th of May 1918 with a telegram ordering the local authorities to prevent by all means the further movement of Czechoslovak troops transports to the east and to shoot any Czechoslovak who was caught on the Trans-Siberian Railway with a gun in his hand. The Czechoslovak volunteers considered this as a declaration of war. The Czechoslovaks in Russia thus found themselves in 3 wars at the same time. First, as part of the Entente armies, they fought against the Central Powers in the First World War. Second, as Czechoslovak troops, they fought against Czechoslovak loyalists loyal to Emperor Charles I, and Czechoslovak Red Army loyalists loyal to Lenin in the war for independence from Austria-Hungary and Soviet Russia. And thirdly, they were now also one of the fighting sides in the Russian Civil War. The Czechoslovak Corps was at the time of the ambush torn into 6 mutually isolated groups: the Penza, Chelyabinsk, Novonikolayevsk, Mariinsk, Nizhny Udinsk and Vladivostok groups. On the map, Czechoslovak forces are blue. Red is Red Army and the internationalists who were German and Austrian prisoners of war serving in the Red Army, and green are Russian anti-Bolshevik troops and other allies like Japanese or Poles. The soldiers of each Czechoslovak group resisted Bolshevik attempts to disband their units, seized the railway station where their transports were stationed, armed themselves in captured war horses and began to break through to join the other groups. By the August, the Czechoslovak Corps had taken control of the entire Trans-Siberian Railway from the Volga to the Pacific Ocean. Russian local anti-Bolshevik governments began to emerge in the liberated territory. The most legitimate of them was a committee of deputies from the Bolshevik disbanded Constituent Assembly in Samara. Czechoslovak Red Army Regiment was virtually wiped out during this fratricidal struggle as well. These operations nullified German gains after the defeat of Russia. At first they blocked in Siberia, the Russian Far East and Kazakhstan hundreds of thousands of German and Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war, whom the Central Powers badly needed on the Western Front and in Italy. And second, they created a real threat of full-scale intervention by the Entente in Russia and the creation of a new Eastern Front, which slowed the movement of Central Powers troops from the liquidated Eastern Front to the west. Together with the arrival of the American army in France, this was the decisive moment by which the balance of power in the First World War changed, definitively in favor of the Entente. The remarkable performance of the Czechoslovak volunteers brought international recognition of Czechoslovak independence in June by France, in August by Britain, and in September by the United States and Japan, and recognition of the Czechoslovak National Council in Paris as the official representative of the emerging state. In late October and early November 1918, three events occurred that significantly changed the situation of the Czechoslovak volunteers. The Czech National Committee in Prague declared the establishment of the independent Czechoslovakia on the 28th of October 1918. Czech and Slovak soldiers from the Austro-Hungarian army in the homeland began to join the Czechoslovak Home Army. In Compiègne, Germany signed an armistice on the 11th of November 1918, and the fights of the First World War ceased. The participation of Czechoslovak volunteers in both the First World War and the War of Independence was thus crowned with a complete and dazzling success. However, in the Third War, in which Czechoslovak volunteers were simultaneously engaged, the Russian Civil War, events took a tragic turn. The Russians in the liberated territory were too slow to realize the mortal danger they faced from the Lenin's government side, and were only hesitantly building up their own volunteer army. Crucial to the disaster of civilization in Russia in 1918 was the decision of US President Wilson not to intervene in Siberia in the summer of 1918 with all the Entente forces then available for that battlefield, especially on the Volga front. President Wilson apparently did not believe that the Bolsheviks were supported from Germany and regarded their rise as an authentic expression of the wishes of the Russian electorate. He therefore prevented the support of the Entente to the anti-Bolshevik Russians, thus putting them at a strong disadvantage in the internal political rivalry. However, this deprived the Entente of a liberated Russia, which would have been a solid support for the Versailles system in the post-war period. In the context of the First World War, however, the Bolshevik regime in Russia was a puppet state of Wilhelmine Germany. In contrast, the German Kaiser repatriated Russian prisoners of war from Germany and Austria-Hungary. This greatly strengthened Lenin's Red Army in summer 1918. Lenin, introducing compulsory conscription into the Red Army, enforced by drastic punishments, and aware of Germany's condescending neutrality in the West, threw all his forces against the Russians and anti-Bolshevik People's Army and the Czechoslovak First Division on the Volga. The anti-Bolsheviks front on the Volga gradually collapsed in September and had to be evacuated to the southern Urals. On the night of November 17, 1918, a coup was carried out in Omsk by the Minister of Military Affairs of the Russian Anti-Bolshevik Directorium, Vice Admiral Alexander Kolchak. Faced with the collapse of the Volga front, he imposed a heavy-handed government. However, by using political assassinations and execution of his anti-Bolshevik political rivals, he soon began to emulate his Bolshevik opponents. This led to a further diversion by democratically minded Czechoslovak soldiers from Russian problems. By mid-January 1919, the Czechoslovak regiments gradually handed over their position to the Kolchak's Russian army and were withdrawn to the rear. In the spring and summer, they protected the Trans-Siberian Railway in central Siberia. In the winter of 1919-1920, after the defeat of Russian anti-Bolshevik armies, Czechoslovak army in Russia withdrew to Vladivostok and was evacuated to homeland. Thank you for your attention, and I apologize for being late.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like now to introduce the third speaker, and that is our good friend Giacomo Innocenti. He wrote a PhD thesis in 2013 on the subject Between National Priorities and Continental Commitment, the British Strategy during World War I, and the intervention on the Italian front 1917-1919. He did several studies. One of them was an advanced course with scholarship in intelligence and national security at the University of Florence, 2018-2019. And in a short time, I believe he told me that he will enlist with the Italian Navy as a reserve officer. Giacomo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. In 1915, Italy entered the First World War fighting on the side of the Entente powers, which were, of course, France, Great Britain, and Russia, against the so-called Central Empires, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and later the Ottoman Empire. The reason why Italy joined the fight was that the Italian government wanted to complete the country's process of unification. That meant to occupy the territories that the Italians called terre irredente, the unredeemed lands. In particular, Italy wanted to conquer the cities of Trieste and Trento, at that time both controlled by Austria-Hungary. Considering the theme of this conference, I would like to highlight that in the Italian propaganda of that time, the war was presented as an independence war. For this reason, the war against the Austria-Hungary Empire, which was the country that fought against the Italian unification in the 18th century, was presented as the last Italian independence war. But back to the topic, Italy had another goal. It wanted to become the leading power over the Adriatic Sea and the Balkan area. Of course, this goal was opposed by Austria-Hungary. But it is extremely important to notice that a good number of its new allies weren't happy at all about the Italian interest over the Balkans. As a matter of fact, Serbia and France were clearly against the Italian aim. The first one because it wanted to unify all the region. The second one because it had important interest in the area and it did not want that Italy gained too much power. With the entry of Italy into the war from May 15, to achieve its war aim, the Italian Royal Army constantly attacked Austria-Hungary in order to break through the Alps and so to reach Ljubljana. This plan failed because the extremely difficult battlefield and the fierce Austro-Hungarian resistance stopped all the Italian efforts to destroy the enemy army and to conquer the cities, of course, of Trento and Trieste. At the same time, in the sea, the Royal Italian fleet failed to achieve supremacy over the Adriatic Sea because the Austrian-Hungarian fleet cleverly exploited the characteristics of the Dalmatian coast, avoiding to clash with the Italian major ships. After almost 2 years of continuous offensive at the end of 1917, there were 11 Italian offensives. The situation was almost the same at the beginning of the conflict. In order to resolve the deadlock, Italy tried to ask more assistance by its allies, but France and Great Britain were quite busy on the Western Front, and they were not really interested about the Italian conflict. They just wanted that the Italian army kept fighting the Austro-Hungarians, so Vienna could not send troops to the Western Front. At the same time, French and British hoped that Austria-Hungary, weakened by the Italians, asked for help to Germany. If this case occurred, Berlin had to give resources to its allies, losing energies on the Western Front. At the end, before the Battle of Caporetto, the assistance given by the British and the French was very poor, speaking about the number of men and artillery. Understanding the difficult military situation, the Italian government followed a new strategy to weaken the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If the enemy army was so cohesive, then the Italians would try to destabilize the empire by the inside, fomenting the independence forces within the Austria-Hungary, such as the Czechoslovakians, the Polish, the Romanians, and the Southern Slavs. This was not a completely new strategy, because even in the period before the war, Italy tried to gain influence in the Balkans. This interest was made clear by the marriage between the future king of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele III, and Elena of Montenegro in 1896. The marriage was a kind of declaration of the interest of Italy over the area. During the Balkan Wars, in 1912-1913, Italy had already tried to create a space of influence in the area, creating connection with Montenegro and extending its influence in Albania. But Italy, to ensure that a good relationship with Austria-Hungary is maintained, did not try to extend excessively its interests in the Balkans. We have to remember that in the end, that in the clauses of the Triple Alliance, there were agreements relating the balancing of interest in the Balkans, with possible compensation in the event of changes of the situation in the area. Of course, with the war, all these bonds were broken, and so Italy started to reorganize its strategy over the Slavs, fomenting their desires of independence in order to create troubles inside the empire and to crack the compactness of the Austrian-Hungarian forces. This strategy was not accepted even inside Italy and the Allies. At the same time, there were some problems with Serbia, who wanted to unify the Balkans, as I said before, and of some representatives of the Slav who did not trust the Italian intentions, and France that didn't want that Italy grow too strong in the area. In Italy, there were a lot of skeptics about the utility of helping the people inside the empire. The most important figure among them was Sonnino, one of the prominent and most influential members of the Italian government, because he was the foreign minister. Sidney Sonnino was a strict follower of the London Pact, in which was written that a part of Dalmatia was going to be Italian at the end of the war. He was worried that if independence has been granted to these countries, Italy would not have had all the territories that interested it. At the same time, Sonnino, as a lot of other European leaders, believed that the Habsburg Empire was the stabilizing element of the center and the southwest Europe. They believed that at the end of the war, there would have been the empire, smaller maybe, but still existing. The perception of the future of the empire changed after Caporetto. The Italian army was dramatically defeated in that battle. The combined forces of German 14th Army and the Austrian-Hungarian Army advanced down the Alps and reached the Piave River, occupying a large part of the Italian country. Considering the situation, a change of strategy was in order. Italy had to find all the instruments to defend itself and weaken its enemy. It was extremely important to find a new and effective strategy. The new strategy had to work inside the stronger weakness of the enemy. The multicultural empire was showing an increasing discontent inside its nations after 4 years of war. The situation has to be used by the Italians. In the contest, on 8th April 1918, began the Congress of Oppressed Nationalities in Rome. In this meeting, there were members of the Italian cultural and political elites, such as Albertini, the director of the main Italian newspaper, the Corriere della Sera, Federzoni, Salvemini, Oietti, who was one of the most active members of the organization of the conference, the journalist Prezzolini, one of the rough and most influent internal propaganda maker, and another journalist that maybe you know, Mussolini. At the same time, there were the representatives of different nationalities, such as Beneš, Stefanik for the Czechs and the Slovaks, Trubic and Stojanovic for the Yugoslav and the Serbs, Skirmut for the Polish, and Morinescu of the Romans, for the Romans. It is really important to highlight that there was no representative of the Italian government. Sonnino did not trust the intention of this man, and he was worried of the consequences that the Congress could have had for peace after the war. After all the works and declaration of friendship, not all sincere, the final declaration of the Congress was as follows. The intent agrees that the dual monarchy must be dismembered, and that the Allies are ready to support with all material and moral means the now threatening effort of the national units of Austrian-Hungarian Empire, who wants to break the overbearing yoke of a minority of just over 20 million German-Hungarians. Only after this conclusion, Sonnino and the Italian government declared their hope that the conference succeeded. But for him, Sonnino, the peace after the war had to be as it was written on the London Pact. He remained convinced of this heaven even after the Italian Prime Minister's statements. Orlando, the Italian Prime Minister, had declared that the future creation of a friendly Yugoslav state imposed the necessity of rethink the relation with the Southern Slavs. Besides this duplicity of the Italian leadership, the declaration of the Congress raised the immediate conditions to begin the new strategy, with the strong help of the British newspaper, in particular the Times of Lord Northcliffe. The first thing was the new propaganda led by the Italian army that published a huge amount of paper. It's extremely important to underline the role of this propaganda activity played in the last phases of the conflict. Here are some data. In 6 months, in the period between May 1918 and November 1918, about 51 million leaflets and 9 million newspapers are thrown across the front line into the ranks of the Austrian-Hungarian army. It must be said that a similar strategy was being implemented on the Western Front, where since the spring in 1918, Lord Knocklit, who was, as a matter of fact, a minister of propaganda for the British government, has ordered a distribution of over 100,000 leaflets per day across the German lines. The disruptive factor of the so-called oppressed nationalities, therefore, is undoubtedly one of the determining factors for the defeat of the Central Empires, especially for the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. But it's not only propaganda that Italy used. During the war, a large number of Austrian-Hungarian prisoners was taken by the Italians. As it is common use, a lot of them were interrogated to gather information about the enemy. Some deserters who declared their desire to fight against the Habsburg Empire were used as spies and sent back to gather informations. So the first units were directly used by the Italian military intelligence. The most famous was the Slovenian Captain Pivko, who tried to infiltrate Italian units inside the Austrian-Hungarian lines in 1917. So the Italian army created some units composed by former Austrian-Hungarian soldiers. Their instructions were not to fight, but to make contact with Habsburg soldiers. In this way, they would have tried to make other men to leave the Austrian-Hungarian ranks. After the declaration of Rome, the Italian army decided to create new combat units made by former prisoners. The most important units were the Czechoslovakian division. In Italy, just from the beginning of the war, the Czechoslovakian soldiers were imprisoned in separate prison camps. That was made in the perspective to use them, knowing that a lot of them had anti-Austrian-Hungarian feelings. That was not something completely new. Some Czech fought with the Serbian army, and there were already units in the Imperial Russian army. At the same time, on the Western Front, there was the Czechoslovakian Legion organized by the French army. After the recognition of the Czechoslovakia as an independent state with the agreement of the 21st April 1918, in Italy was created the 39th Czechoslovak Regiment. This unit was integrated with other Czechoslovak soldiers and was created the 6th Czechoslovakian Division. Why the number 6? Because there were already 5 divisions in French and Russians of Czechoslovakian. Some numbers. At the beginning of May, the division already had almost 200 officers and 10,000 non-commissioned officers and soldiers. In the division, there were even almost 200 Italian officers and 1,000 Italian non-commissioned officers and soldiers. Most of the technical department and the company level commanders were Italians. The strength of the division would have been further increased, even with the introduction of the 39th Regiment, up to 20,000 men. After the increasing number of new volunteers coming from prisoners or from deserters, it was created a new division and so an army corps. These troops were used in the front line and fought bravely during the last Italian battle, the Vittorio Veneto battle. 5 minutes. Other nationalities were used in the Italian army, such as the Romanian, who were used at the beginning as information and propaganda task, and then with the other volunteers was created company and some centuries of soldiers who were used for the infiltration in particular. And they fought bravely even in the Italian sector with the British and the French unit in the mountain. Another group was composed by the Yugoslav, and this was the group that gave much problem. The creation of a Yugoslav legion was not possible for 2 reasons. The first was there were not enough of them, so mixed units were created with Czechoslovaks. The second was that the Serbian government wanted that these units fought as part of the Serbian army. This situation created some problems because Italy did not want to give a new instrument to a state that was going to be a competitor in the Balkan area. There were problems with the units on the field. In fact, one battalion refused to enter the line before swearing allegiance to King Peter. The last foreign soldiers were the Albanians, who were dislocated in Albany and fought particularly under the orders of Italian officers, just to remember the Italian interest in the area. The war in Europe ended in November 1918. The Central Powers were defeated and an unpredicted event happened. The Habsburg Empire was no more. The different nationalities inside Austria-Hungary declared their independence, and this new situation was originated by different causes. The first was the new politics expressed by the United States, the actor who changed the balance of power at the end of the war, demanding an application of the self-determination of the people inside the empire. The same politic applied by the other winners of the war, even if not in all cases. The second was the collapse of the Austrian-Hungarian army. That was the institution that actually held the whole empire together. Without that, there was no more power capable to keep the state united. The third reason was the centrifugal forces within the empire. The forces during the war created many problems inside the empire, weakening the cohesion of the Austrian-Hungarian society. Italy surely had a part in this. The Italian army, after 4 years of war, surely exhausted the Austrian-Hungarian military forces, and that was clear in particular before the Battle of Caporetto, when Austria-Hungary was obliged to ask Germany for help. We have to add this, the contribution given to the independence of the subject nationalities in the empire. The constant propaganda among the troops and the population, the institution of military units such as the Czechoslovakians and the Romanian, created true threat to the cohesion of the enemy army. Was this effort useful for the Italian war goals? Of course, this helped to weaken the empire, the enemy. But on a larger point of view, Italy, although it's supported by the independence of those states, was not capable of creating a strong relation with the new Czechoslovakian Republic. And the possibility to extend its influence on the Balkans was lost with the creation of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovens, who immediately was the new competitor in the Adriatic Sea. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Giacomo. I would first like to thank all three speakers staying within time. But before we go to the questions and answers part of this session, another home rule. State your name and country before your question, please. Christian, where's the mic?
Thank you. Christian Norton from Vienna. Of course, there has to be a statement regarding the Empire of Evil, the Habsburg Empire. Anyway, I think just a few comments. The problem of the Austro-Hungarian state as a multicultural, multinational state, I think, is well known. I think the interesting effect is that due to the last results of research, that the political situation during the war was quite interesting because most of the nations heading for some kind of independence or autonomy had, let's say, a double strategy. At home, they stayed loyal, and of course, they had someone abroad, just in case who wins the war. And it's quite interesting that, especially regarding the Czech perspective, and I think Tomáš can give some details on this, most of the Czech soldiers stayed loyal within the Imperial and Royal Army, but they had their legions as well. On the other hand, the big question was who really started the nationalization of war. And it's quite interesting, nobody really knows that it had been the Austro-Hungarian forces who played the national card at first. It was in 1914 when they raised a Polish legion, just to convince Polish soldiers from the Russian army to change lines and fight for Austria and for an independent Polish kingdom. The same was with Ukraine, an Ukraine Legion. And the name of Völkerkerker was invented not by some politicians after the war, but it was invented by German and Austrians in 1915 against the Russians. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I think it's quite interesting that the gain of a national state is some kind of, let's say, marketing, because as an irony of history, all the succeeding states of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy have been multinational states, besides tiny little Austria and tiny little Hungary. We had Czechoslovakia with Czechs, Germans, Hungarians, Slovaks. We have Romania, we have Yugoslavia. So it's quite interesting that all the succeeding states inherited our problems we had before, and thanks God we don't have these problems anymore. Thank you. Just a comment.
Thank you, Christian. Gentlemen, any reactions? Giacomo?
Yeah, if I can. I never thought that the Habsburg Empire was the evil, just to be clear. Yes, but yes, of course, me too. But just to, there was during the war, of course, Italy and the other power of the Entente tried to find a way to justify their intervention, the war, and using all the instruments that they had, because the situation, speaking about Italy after the Battle of Caporetto, was extremely problematic, and the use, as I said, as I tried to say before, of this strategy was not even accepted by all the Italian members of the government. There was a fight inside the government because they were afraid that giving some new justification of these new nationalities was a threat at the long term of the Italian interest. And actually it happened in speaking about the new Yugoslav state. So, yes, thank you.
Okay, Thomas, perhaps?
Thank you. I tried to make the distinction between conscript and volunteer armies. The problem of Czechs and Slovaks serving within the Austro-Hungarian army was that they were conscripts, and the Austro-Hungarian state has a lot of possibilities how to force them to fight until the end. So the most important for us is that the so-called, in English language, Czech Legion, or as I call them, Czechoslovak volunteers, were volunteer army. The people who were already on the front, they had frontline experience, but they voluntarily went again to Czechoslovak volunteer units to express their meaning. So this is something that we, as scientists, shouldn't forget the feelings of the people in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Any more questions? Alon.
Thank you. Alon Klebanov, Israel. Question to Lar. Thank you very much for an interesting paper, but I have a few questions, remarks or questions. First of all, to which extent we are in the framework of national movements, to which extent you would identify or distinguish or term the Irish national movement from Wolftown from 1798 until 1916 as a popular movement, grassroots level? You see that throughout the 19th century there are various stages, Emmet Fenian movements, etc., etc. But when it comes to 1916, you find that a large number of soldiers are fighting during the First World War in the service of the Crown, and you find that there is a strong opposition to the uprising among Irish, the national opinion. Many people said traitors. You know, we are in the middle of a major war, and suddenly comes this gang, whatever. To which extent do you think it's a grassroots level vis-a-vis small minority forcing its view and its way upon much larger group. First thing. Second thing, to which extent was foreign involvement? I mean, Sir Roger Casement, the Germans trying to send this ship with the equipment to the would-be rebels against the British Empire. And the last question, do you think that the British government contributed by executing the leaders of the Eastern Rebellion to the change of the popular opinion and actually contributing most to what had happened from 1916 until 1921? Thank you.
Alon, thank you. Lar?
Thank you very much, Alan, for the wonderful questions. No, you're right. By 1916, most Irish citizens had come to an accommodation with the British government and the British Empire. As you say, within World War I, 200,000 of them are at the front fighting in Irish regiments and Irish divisions. So there had, although there had been a series of small risings throughout the 19th century, most historians would now agree that an accommodation had come, an acceptance had happened. So the rising in 1916 really is the last throw of the dice for your traditional hardcore Fenians, as we call them. And they knew that themselves. And this was the last chance to change public opinion. And to kind of jump to your third question is, through the execution policy, the execution policy was quite violent. 15 were executed, but the plan had been to execute 90 in a 2-week period, in a 4-week period. That changed public opinion. So for what most, we didn't do opinion polls in 1916, but what you can see is huge opposition to a small group of Republicans, Fenians, who have rebelled against the British government. And then the execution started a week after the 1916 rising. And within a 3-week period of executions, the British government essentially lose Ireland. They lose the moral, and if you like, propaganda claim that they are a benevolent empire. The attitude from the British government, of course, was this has happened in the middle of a war, therefore we must suppress this. And there was a misunderstanding and misreading that the Irish were not allying themselves with the Germans because they were supporters of Germany. They were taking a very traditional approach, is my enemy's enemy is my friend, so therefore, so it had been the Spanish in the 1600s, then the French, it didn't really matter. So there was a misreading by the British authorities, and also there was kind of a classic kind of imperial power coming back to, that's the Irish, they have to be taught a lesson. So everyone, in a way, went back to, had come to an accommodation, an acceptance. When the rebellion happens, they go back into their traditional of, he's my enemy approach, hardcore, and that's when the walls go up. The execution policy then changes quite dramatically. So the revolutionists themselves realised that this was the last throw of the dice for themselves, and it worked. Simply through a failed, terribly planned rising, badly executed rising, but through the executions they created martyrs. And that comes back to your classic counterinsurgency. Once you create a martyr, you're moving away from the military, you're creating a myth. And it's through national myths that we see wars of independence. And I focused on the military in my talk, but the reality is that the Irish ran a very clever propaganda publicity campaign from 1919 to 2021. Anything that happened in Ireland was being reported in the New York Times the next day, Chicago, elsewhere around the world. The French newspapers were fascinated with the War of Independence. And in many ways, they understood the importance of getting the message out. And the more that happened, the British realised that if they went into a very kind of militant and military approach to suppressing the rebellion, internationally, they were going to be damaged by doing that. So the Irish did the classic. They didn't have enough guns, they didn't have enough men, but what they had, they used well.
Thank you, Lar. The questions. First, gentleman in the background, then you are. Microphone, please.
Peter Lieb from the German Commission. My question goes to Lar. I read a couple of times that the later Field Marshal Montgomery issued harsh orders when he was in Ireland, so burning down houses. I don't know whether this is true about shooting suspects and so forth and so on. I wonder whether you could answer me the question whether this is true that Montgomery issued this order, and if yes, what was the exact content? Was this order executed, and was it a standard order, or was it an order that was disseminated in his unit or probably promulgated by himself?
Again, another great question. He was a brigade major in one of the brigades in Cork. From memory, it was more about the taking of hostages. So in 1921, as British Army patrols went out, they started to take civilians as hostages, and they were then carried in vehicles. They were intermingled in a patrol so that attacks wouldn't happen. So if I remember correctly, that was his context. When his only comment, I think, in his autobiography on it is that everyone in Ireland was a Sinn Féiner. So again, in 1921, there was this kind of perception that the whole of the society was against them. And again, that was a misreading by the British authorities. They could have found their own allies and groups within Ireland to work with. But there was a kind of a brush approach of everybody is a Sinn Féiner, which is the political party. Everyone is a Republican, so therefore there's no point trying to kind of meet them halfway. So yeah, he was very disappointed by his own experiences there. He was only there for a short period. But once you go into 1921, there's official appraisals start to take place. So it is an official policy. So in 1920, it's again soldiers and policemen responding angrily to attacks, and then it becomes an official response as you go into 1921. And you see that in other wars.
Okay, thank you, Lar. First, gentleman here on the front, and after that, Herr Schmidl.
Hello, Mr. Tuyal from Turkish Commission. My question related with the Czech legions. The first one is, as far as I know, when the problem with the Czech units started, the Austrians transferred them against the Italians, and unreliable units automatically transform into very loyal fighting units. Am I wrong? This is the first part of the question. The second part, I guess the Czech legion's role played more in propaganda value than in real-term issues, because I recently read something about this infamous Prague regiment, and it turned out that the Prague regiment's problems had something to do with the commanding officers than the real nationalistic issues. And as you remember, the reason Woodrow Wilson, the President of America, presented or tried to convince the American public to commit American units to Russian civil war had something to do with the Czech Legion. They said that we needed to save brave, small people fighting for independence. So I am again agreeing with my Austrian colleague that actually the nationalism issue is a product of war, something built up at the front line with the misery. So the Czechs fighting against the Russians may be problematic, various, but the same guys fought valiantly against the Italians. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Thomas? Giacomo?
About the loyalty of the Czech units inside the Austrian-Hungarian army, that's the first part of the question, if I recall.
They were more loyal than presented.
Yes, sure, because as a matter of fact, I don't remember the number of the Czech soldiers inside the Austrian-Hungary was quite impressive. And the number of the Czech former prisoners who fight alongside the Italian army. Was quite different, but of course they were used for propaganda reason inside the intent, and well, the effectiveness on the field of them was by what I have read. They were good units, but the most important thing that they have done during the First War, the Czech Legion inside the Italian army, was the gathering formations in particular. That was the most important thing. In fact, the 38th Czech Regiment in the Italian sector was used for reconnaissance in particular. And yes, the exploit of the nationalities inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire was used as an instrument in particular. So that's my, what I know about this topic, of course. But this division was, during the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, they fight gallantly by all the reports that I had the possibility to check. Well, of course, the number were different inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire army and the member of the Czechs inside Czechoslovakians inside the Italian army. Just to conclude the answer, the use of these units inside the Italian army was partially, they were used partially because the Austro-Hungarian army that was presented after the war as an absolutely ineffective and not cohesive army was not, as a matter of fact, like this during the war. So the Czech inside the Italian army were, sorry for the expression, a tool, try to break this cohesion, that's true. Thank you very much for your question.
Concerning your second and third questions, the problem of nationalism in Austro-Hungarian Empire wasn't created by propaganda during the First World War, definitely. The problem existed prior to the First World War, and to make the complex problem, to describe this complex problem in short, we can say that there were three main areas or three main type of nationalism. Problem of Czech, Poles, Romanians, South Slaves, and so on. It's very well known, but it's less known that besides the Austro-Hungarian statehood or state nationalism or loyalism, that there were third part of this problem, and this was German nationalism, because the German-speaking inhabitants of Austro-Hungary felt themselves as German living in Bohemia, for example, German living in Italian territories and so on, and they were against Austro-Hungarian state as well. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire had not only the enemies from the side of the Entente supporters, but also from the German Redenta, who was willing to make great Germany by absorbing non-Hungarian parts of Austro-Hungary. So the problem was very complex, and it was concerning that you mentioned the 28th Regiment and its collapse on the Eastern Front, and so it's very complex question, because a lot of there are several studies about this case from the wartime propaganda, which describe this affair, that the whole regiment came with its band to the Russian side, and the collapse of this regiment was complex, and the investigation during the war by Austro-Hungarian authorities is very influenced by attempt of officers of that regiment to cover their own failures, for example. So this is a very complex question, not only which could not be only limited to propaganda questions. And concerning Wilson's propaganda, it's Wilson's propaganda, but there are a lot of studies about the Russian Civil War that shows a different picture than the Wilson's propaganda. Thank you.
Am I right that the Czechs fought more loyal against the Italians?
That is problem that on the Italian front, the front was in a mountainous terrain, which not allowed too much possibilities to desert on the opposite side. In contrary to Russian front, which was in terrain relatively suitable for a desertion.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. One last question, and that's for Mr. Schmiedl.
Thank you very much, Erwin Schmiedl, Vienna. Thank you also for 3 very enlightening papers. I have 2 questions, actually. One goes to Thomas Jackl. When I read the title of your paper and you mentioned civil war, I had not really expected you to talk about the Russian Civil War, but about what happened in Bohemia and Moravia in the winter of 1918-19, when the new Czechoslovak authority took control of the German areas of the new state of Czechoslovakia. And so maybe if you could comment on this, and also how the new Czechoslovak army was created, combining parts of the old Austro-Hungarian army, which stayed loyal until the very end, and the new Czechoslovak legions, which were imported into Czechoslovakia mainly in 1919-1920 only. My second question goes to Lar. When we talked in the discussion about these measures of retaliation, they sound very much like the measures employed by the British in South Africa during the Second Anglo-Boer War, and I wondered whether there was a direct link of using experience from South Africa in Ireland. Thank you.
First question to Thomas, then to Lar.
Thank you. You're right that the topic was, I intended to cover this topic as well, but the length of my paper then was enormous, and despite I shortened it, it was too long for the 20-minute limit. So the problem, as a colleague from Vienna told, was that the new created state inherited the problems of multinationality in the Central Europe, and we can trace these problems up to the Second World War, where the plan for Great Germany was or came to reality by the Third Reich actions. So, in short, in 1919, the Germany-speaking inhabitants of Bohemia, before the end of the First World War, declared their belonging to Austria, but they were suppressed by the newly created Czechoslovak army, and the historical borders of Czechoslovakia were established.
Yes, and there's very strong links between Ireland and South Africa for both the IRA commanders and the British commanders. Are both looking back to it. Ironically, during the South African War, 7,500 Irishmen had fought with the British Army, and then about 500 have fought with the Boers. So again, this is kind of a running theme in Irish military history, that the Irish are always on the both sides of a battle. And that again kind of shows the mass emigration from the country in the 19th century, which is about 2.5 million. So therefore, they do end up on both sides. The IRA in particular spent a lot of their time teaching their officers what the learnings from the guerrilla campaign at the Boers, and very much kind of followed those theories. When it came to the British Army, they didn't focus on civilians. The civilians were left alone within the War of Independence. But there was the understanding of taking young men off the streets and putting them into camps. So by June 1921, Michael Collins was the leading general, was very concerned about the lack of weapons, but he was also running out of willing IRA volunteers. So there were about 4,500 men in camps, in prison camps around Ireland. And again, and they were predominantly under the age of 30. So therefore, a high proportion of the male population under 30 was taken off the streets. So they were very, very quickly running out of men. So there are definitely correlations between the South African campaign and Ireland.
Okay, thank you, Lar and Thomas. Before ending this interesting session, I would make an announcement for the Bulgarian Commission. They informed me that during the coffee break they will have the ACTA proceedings from the Sofia Congress in 2019. There will be one example of one book for every board commission member and one for each national commission. Well, I would now like to end this session. I would like to thank the distinguished speakers. I would also like to thank the questionnaires, the audience, the translators, of course, and the ICT crew. And I wish you all a pleasant and fruitful day further on. Thank you.